Okay, unfortunately the person who was going to present today has got conjunctivitis and his eyeballs are out here. So I've stepped in at the last moment and I hope it's okay. So I'm just going to go through where proton therapy is at the moment in the UK. Are there any people associated with radiation therapy or radiographers here? Okay. I was told there wouldn't be any, but never mind. That's fine. Okay, so firstly, I'd like to thank my manager, Kevin Sullivan, and Hazel Pennington, who are the two leads for the project for the UK, one up in Manchester and one here down at UCLH, and Richard Amos and the other proton physicists that are part of the project. And all the slides that I have are from those guys. So basically, my presentation will go through what is so special about protons, how is it different to the bog standard radiotherapy that you get in every department, a little bit about the history, how they're produced, and some clinical examples of where they have been used until now, and what the current UK position is, so what we are doing with patients that go abroad, and how we're going to ramp up with the new proton therapy departments that are going to open in the future. So what is so special about protons? Initially, this was going to be a presentation for students, so there was lots of equations and lots of physics in this, but I've pared it down. So there are lots of different sorts of radiation and radiation types that you can use for treatment delivery, but the key one to look at here is the black line. So as your radiation goes further into tissue, you can see that the intensity of it decreases with increasing depth. So this is normal radiotherapy. With proton therapy, most of the dose is actually given at a particular depth, and that depth is proportional to the energy of the beam. So if you know what the energy of your beam is, you know where all of the dose, or pretty much all of the dose, most of the dose is going to be deposited. Just another picture of that. So with a single beam, you can see that most of the dose is given at this depth here, and it doesn't continue to decrease as the grey line and photon therapy did in the previous slide. So what does this mean in reality? Well, if you compare the sort of photon therapy distribution, which goes down as you get further into tissue, with a proton distribution, if your tumour happened to be here, with photons to hit this bit here, you would have to irradiate the patient at this end and further into the patient. Whereas with photons, it's all deposited here. So basically that means that whenever you treat with photon therapy, there is an entry dose that is additional to what you would like to give the patient, and there's an exit dose as well. So in terms of patient toxicity, yes, in both cases you're treating the tumour, but with photons, standard radiotherapy, you're treating a lot extra either side. And this is where a lot of the patient toxicity comes from the treatments that we give. If you looked at the media, you'd think this was a very new thing. Proton therapy is actually very, very old. The first proposition by Robert Wilson was back in 1946. And within 10 years at the Berkeley Laboratory, they started to make a working cyclotron that was able to deliver proton therapy. And the first sites for this treatment were all brain tumours. And predominantly over the next 20 years or so, almost all of the proton therapy treatments were for brain tumours, primarily because it is quite easy to localise where that tumour is. There's, even from basic X-rays, you can see different portions of the brain that you would want to treat. And they were able to give very high doses to very localized areas. And it wasn't until the sort of late 70s to 80s where CT scanners became a lot more prevalent, then you can start to plan more complex treatments. But until the 80s, most of these facilities were in research facilities, in physics laboratories, so not in the hospital setting. The PSI is a very famous institute in Switzerland that I've been to, and it's pretty much like a car park. You walk in, it's an industrial estate, there's lots of hangars everywhere. It just looks like you've walked into a Ford plant or something. But that's where it started. Now, the first hospital-based system, the UK actually has a proton therapy department. It's up at the Clatterbridge, but it is a low-energy system. So by this, as I've said previously, the penetration of the beam is going to be relatively very small. So what they treat there are mainly ocular melanomas and things in and around the eye because obviously the penetration that you need for that is relatively small compared with, say, something in the pelvis or in the chest. So they were actually the first hospital-based department in the world, closely followed by the Loma Linda Institute in California. Proton beam therapy departments are very, very expensive. A linear accelerator might cost £3, £4, £5 million. The facilities that I'm going to be talking about cost £250 million. So it's an order of magnitude much greater, which is why a lot of these were sort of physics-based laboratory scenarios. So just to do a very basic diagram here of how these things are produced, you have your protons in the cyclotron, and the cyclotron basically is a very large magnet that has an electric field applied across it. And the protons are spun round and round, getting faster and faster, acquiring greater and greater energy. And once you've got that up to the energy of the beam that you want, which is normally about 250 mega electron volts. So if you compare that to, say, a diagnostic X-ray, which may be a couple of hundred, it is much more intense. So then the beam is guided with some more magnets along a trajectory here, and then goes off to treat the patient. And we'll go into this sort of pathway in a bit more detail. But typically you have one source of protons, and then this feeds several of these things that are called gantries. So your patient will lie on a table, and the beam will be guided into whichever bit of the patient that needs to be treated. But typically you have 2 or 3 of these gantries, and they work in parallel. So the beam will be in one machine or the other, but not both at the same time. So in terms of throughput of patients, there are lots of things that you need to consider about who gets the beam first, and you can't get the beam until somebody else has finished. So again, in the media, there's a lot of discussion about is the UK buying the latest technology, is it out of date, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what 90% of the proton departments in the world are using. This is not what we're buying. This is slightly old-fashioned. So the beam, as we've seen, comes out of the proton generator, goes to the patient, but obviously you don't always want to treat the maximum depth. Some tumours are more superficial than others. So you introduce something into the beam that, in effect, lessens the intensity of the beam so it doesn't penetrate so far into normal tissue. You also want to shape the beam, because obviously it's not going to be a rectangle or a square, but to shape to the actual edges of the tumour that you want to treat. Now, this is the old way of doing this. All of these things have to be milled and created per beam. So there's a lot of hardware that needs to be produced for the patient. And if the tumour changes shape during that course of treatment, then obviously all of these things need to be done again. If you look at this diagram here, this is your patient, this is the tumour, and you can see by doing all of these things, you can match the distal edge, the far edge of the tumour very well by all of these things that need to be put into the beam. But if you look upstream, you can see that actually it's taken on the same shape as the distal edge. So although it's very good at doing that side, it's less good at doing this side. So as I said, this is sort of 90% of what is happening in the real world today. This is not what we're getting, this is what we're getting. So again, you have your patient. This is called spot scanning. And as the name suggests, the beam comes in and we paint a little dot of dose. So it's a bit like an inkjet printer. The beam comes in, you deposit a little bit of dose at the far side of the tumour, and then you do the next dot up, and the next dot up, and the next dot up. Then you reduce the energy of the beam, and then you do another layer of dots, and then another layer of dots, and it works its way from the far side to the near side. And the beauty of this is that you can paint any physical dose distribution you want. So it doesn't have to be a round blob, it can be an elongated structure, it can be a tangled structure, whichever the shape is that you want to treat, you can deliver. So if you compare that with before, this is a much simpler treatment, and you can see that you're overdosing that side. This will not happen with this technique. It also means that you can use your protons much more efficiently because you're not putting things in the beam to lessen the dose, to shape the dose, etc., etc. It requires no patient-specific hardware, so you don't need a workshop to create this. It means that if things change shape or position, then you can replan that relatively quickly. You don't have to go through the hardware production cycle. And also, there's less neutron background dose. And that's just adding extra dose to the patient that you don't want. So the basic rationale for proton therapy treatment is twofold. In pediatric indications, what you're trying to do is reduce all of that dose that's going into the patient that isn't actually going into the tumour. So it's all that surrounding background of patient. And the flip side of that is that there are some tumours where you can't give the dose that you'd like to give because of the dose to the surrounding tumours. And so instead of, say, giving 60 Gray, maybe we should be giving 70 Gray. But 70 Gray is not feasible with current photon radiotherapy because of the toxicity to the surrounding tissues. So this is a possibility with photon therapy at all. So really it's to do with either reducing the dose to the normal tissues or increasing the dose to the target volume. So here are just some examples. So this is a bit like a weather map. The redder the colours are, the more radiation dose there is, and the lighter, the bluer colours reflect lower doses. So this is what we do at the moment. If you imagine that this red volume here is the volume that we actually want to treat, you can see that that's nicely shaped volume. But with standard treatment, you can see there's a spill-off of dose throughout the rest of the patient, which is, for all intents and purposes, unwanted. You need to give that to give this excellent coverage here. But with protons, you can do this, but you can manage to spare the rest of the patient. And you can see when you look at a dose difference map that there's a lot of dose that would be spared to that patient if you use protons. And obviously, if you look at all the other organs that are in the rest of the brain, if you don't treat them, if you don't give them a radiation dose, they will not experience a toxicity. This is a spinal tumour, obviously treating the spine very conformally and exactly here, but you can see there's dose spill-off into the airways, esophagus, lung, etc., etc. With the proton treatment, it's very tightly targeted around the spinal cord. Esophagus, airways, etc. are getting no dose, and you can see again when you look at the dose difference what a difference it actually makes. There's a large reduction in what we call integral dose, the rest of the dose to the patient. And this is a head and neck case where if you look at the standard treatment, we're avoiding the spinal cord, yes. Avoiding parotid glands, yes. Nice conformal high-dose plan here. But there's a lot of spill-off that goes everywhere else. If you look at the proton plan, you can see it's a very tightly shaped around the area that we want to treat. Again, avoiding the spinal cord, but you're not treating anterior to here. You're not treating these other areas. And if you can imagine if this was a pediatric case, they will not be getting toxicity to this area, growth retardation, etc., because we're not treating these volumes. This is a classic case that everybody shows. This is for a medulloblastoma, where we have to treat the whole of the craniospinal axis. With X-rays at the moment, with a direct field, you can see that the high dose is in the spinal canal where we want it, but there is some dose that's spread to the anterior organs, so to the gut, the heart, etc., etc. With protons, you can actually get that to stop very nicely in mid-vertebra. This is an adult. If it was a child, then you would ensure that the vertebrae were equally covered so you don't get differences in growth in the vertebra. And in fact, you can see that where the proton stops in this MR, it's a very nice picture of showing where it stops dead. Again, in the craniospinal axis treatment, we're trying to avoid the cochleas here to prevent hearing damage. In IMRT, although you get a nice high-dose volume here, you do get some spill-off either side. But again, with proton therapy, you can target that volume much more finely. A little bit about immobilization. All of the departments in the world pretty much use this system, so your patient will lie on this couch underneath that gantry that you saw before, wearing a very, very tight mask that will enable the patient to stay in the same position for each of their treatments. Okay, so what is happening at the moment? Well, NHS England do pay for eligible patients to go abroad, and that's mainly to the USA at the moment, to Oklahoma and Florida, and some patients do go to Switzerland. There's a centralised referral pathway, so if a clinician has a patient that they think falls under the categories that is permitted by NHS England, then they can supply their MR scans, history, etc., and that's centrally reviewed. But it's not ideal. It can be expensive because although the government will pay for the treatment, they don't pay for subsistence. It takes time. It can be disruptive to those people that have families and other children, etc., that they need to then take care of. There is a possibility of the inability to travel with comorbidities, therapies, visa issues, etc., etc. And there is a limited indications list, and that's where it can be found. So this is the current list that we have at the moment. I think it's under review. But basically, they are mainly brain tumours, paediatric tumours, and some sarcomas. And the key things that are looked at is that the treatment has to be given with curative intent, a good performance status, no other issues that were likely to limit the 5-year survival, and the fact that there should be no metastatic disease, as well as all the usual radiotherapy issues with where the tumour is, how big it is, how close it is to the sort of normal tissues, etc., etc. Okay, so the National Proton Beam Service, there will be 2 centres with 3 treatment rooms each, funded by Department of Health capital funding, and payment will be on a tariff-based system. So all of the patients that are currently being sent abroad will be brought back and treated here. And it's envisaged that there'll be about a 1,500 patient workload, 750 in each site, and continuing with this centralised referral process. And this map basically just shows you how, where the population lives relative to the 2 sites that will be. Okay, so the Christie and UCLH were chosen as the 2 sites, but it is referred to as 2 sites and 1 service because of this centralised pathway. And both of these departments are going to be integrated fully within the hospital setting, so not the sort of research physics type facilities that we've seen elsewhere. And they're going to be integrated within conventional photon facilities as well, because it's envisaged that some patients may have photons and protons, perhaps as a boost dose. So it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. And we have to learn to collaborate across all areas to do with protocol development, technology, research, etc. The first of these is due to open in 2018. So why UCH? Well, London is very easy to get to, and that was one of the criteria for being selected. But more specifically, we're quite a large department treating approximately 2,000 patients a year with 14 radiation oncologists. Although this says we do 55% of our workload is IMRT, it's actually closer to 80% now, which just shows the degree of complex radiotherapy that we give. These are some of the things that our clinical leads say we are, but basically we are the 3rd largest paediatric centre in the world. We have a very large sarcoma practice and the largest neurosurgical centre within Europe because of our connection with the National Hospital at Queen's Square. So it fits within the remit of the indications list that was previously on the screen. Okay, so the actual procurement process has been very, very long. Back in 2009, the Department of Health started this process into looking to see which departments would be hosting these services, and eventually UCH and the Christie were chosen, and then it's taken a very long time for the business cases to come through, and the UCH and Christie were awarded this last year, and we're currently working on equipment procurement, centre design, IT network, etc., etc. The The start dates down here, the Christie will probably be opening at the end of 2018 and UCH at 2019, primarily because our build is much more difficult. It's currently the biggest hole in London, just off Tottenham Court Road, and I'll show you some pictures in a second, whereas the Christie site is much easier to get to and build in. So there are lots of challenges with this particular process. This is obviously a new thing to the NHS within radiotherapy. We have to recruit 90 extra radiographers, and for any of you that know, there's a national shortage of radiographers at the moment, so we have to find 90 between us and Manchester. We have to learn how to integrate between the photon and proton departments, but also between us and the Christie to a certain degree to ensure that there's a seamless service. Obviously, we won't be treating all of those patients all at once, and we'll slowly ramp up the numbers. But if the indications list changes for any reason, those numbers will only go one way, and that's up. It's not just about radiographers, but there's the whole gamut of radiotherapy-related staff groups need to be taken on board as well. Another challenge is that at the moment there is a sort of a philosophical paradigm. You start your radiotherapy treatment by having a planning CT immobilized in a particular way, and then you create a person-specific plan, which is then used for a whole course of treatment, which may last 5, 6, 7 weeks. With experience from other sites and within our own research, it's quite obvious that proton therapy in itself is going to be much more complicated. There's going to be much more use of MRI, PET-CT, PET-MR, etc., etc. It's estimated that at least 70% of our patient cohort may need at least one replanning session. At UCH, typically, a planning pathway takes about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the complexity of treatment. If you're replanning once, or possibly even twice or 3 times, you can't afford to let that take you 3 weeks to do. So the planning turnaround will come back to a matter of days, which again is resource heavy. So just as an example, so that's sort of the technical process. This is just one example of things that we need to look out for. This is obviously a lung tumour with a single beam coming in here. Because protons are so accurate, they do what you ask them to. When the situation changes, such as you can see that this is now more rare and that the tumour's disappeared, you can see that the spill-off is much more. So these are things that we need to look out for much more than perhaps we would do with photon radiotherapy. And this could happen on a day-to-day basis or over a week. So there's a lot of reviewing that needs to be done of these cases day by day. Also, from a pragmatic point of view, most radiotherapy departments probably run between 8 and 5, 8 and 6. This system is designed to run from 6 till 10 o'clock for all intents and purposes. The NHS business case is based on only treating 750 patients, which is relatively small, but because they're all complicated, we expect a high percentage of these to be possibly GA. Each patient may well take 45 minutes to treat. So in terms of throughput, it's going to be relatively slow, and therefore we need to be able to facilitate treatment over a very long day. All servicing will be done out of hours, all QA will be done out of hours, so physics time, machine QA is after 11 o'clock in the evening. So what we've done in terms of getting education and training up and running, well, we're starting to do the vendor-specific training, look at overseas visits for this, and I think the first recruitment is starting in 3 or 4 months' time for the lead core position roles. And we're discussing with the national education providers about doing MSc modules, e-learning, CPD, study days, etc., etc. So this is the UCH project. For those of you who know, this is Tottenham Court Road here, this is Grafton Way here, and not only are we building a proton therapy department, which is this bit here, there's going to be a 6-level hospital stuck on top of it as well. Thank you. It's just another diagram of it here. Again, Tottenham Court Road, Grafton Way. So this is what our cyclotron and gantries will look like from underneath. This is our footprint of the department. So the cyclotron is here, and the beam will go into the 3 gantries here. And this is my machine, should I get one. This is the research area here. And apparently I've been told that this is my office down here, the cubby hole. The reason this is a very weird shape is because this is a block of flats just here. We happen to own the bit of pavement here, but not here and here. And this is the Jeremy Bentham pub, which refused to move. So we've had to build the department around it, just there. So there's quite lots of interesting things that we need to think about. We've managed to get a CT and an MR in here. We tried to get a PET CT, but that hasn't quite happened yet. So this is a treatment gantry, and you can see it's relatively large to the engineer down there. Oops, sorry. Okay, so this is what a cyclotron actually looks like. This is the Varian one. And this is the Varian system. And I'm just going to play this video here because I think it actually shows very nicely how proton beam therapy works. There is an American voiceover of this, but fortunately it doesn't play very well. But this is a sales pitch from Varian, but it's actually quite a good video. Do you know what? This is why I never put videos in my presentation. Is that not? I don't know why the screen's. Okay, let's do this. Okay, so this is your patient on a treatment couch, and pretty much this is the workflow of what's going to happen pretty much in real time. So this is 2 kV heads and 2 imaging panels that will take a rudimentary CT of the patient first, and that normally takes about a minute, so that's a little bit speedy going around. Then the radiographer will evaluate the position of the tumour, evaluate the position of the normal organs around it, and once they're happy that the patient's in the right position, eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that this is not a brain tumour, this is in the chest. But this will show you the sort of dose painting that I was mentioning earlier. So the beam will actually come in, paint across, reduce the energy of the beam so the distance is less, etc., and build that up until you treat the whole of the volume. This is not in real time. It's a lot slower than this in real life. So once it's done it from that beam direction, then the gantry will move around and do the next one. And typically there's sort of 2 or 3 beams that they're going to use for this.
Is the machine not UC?
Not any more than a normal linear accelerator. So I'd say relatively no. In total, probably about half an hour to 40 minutes, depending on whether or not they're having a GA. So if you want to know about the Varian system, which is the one that both the Christy and us have purchased, then that's the link for that. So this is so you've seen what it's going to look like. This is what it looks like at the moment, the biggest hole in London. And the key thing to notice is that however tall these buildings are, that's how deep we have to dig down. Again, that's Grafton Way, that's Tottenham Court Road down there. But what we can't forget is that I've spoken about the technology, and it's not about the technology. It's about offering our patients, and paediatrics are going to be a large proportion of them, the opportunity to have their treatment at home and not have their lives disturbed by having to go abroad for 2 or 3 months. And this is one of our patients from UCLH that went to Oklahoma, and him and his family are helping us with advertising. So if you look at the hoardings around the Tottenham Court Road area, you'll see this child and some of the others sort of helping us with fundraising and improving the sort of environment for children within the proton therapy department. Thank you.